possible care for every patient. This is personalized healthcare. This is Roche.
Great. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a chance to go outside and get some air and enjoy a bit of lunch. We have two sessions this afternoon, which will be equally as intriguing as all of the sessions that we've had. You'll note also that the sessions have been structured in a way that build upon each other. What would be really fantastic this afternoon is for the panelists to receive a lot of questions. I know people are more shy on virtual platforms than typically the normal, but please do ask. And particularly for the last session, as we introduce it, we do require and would love quite a bit of input on some implementation planning that's been done by CCC on the charter. So we'll come to that. But first and foremost, I'd like to introduce the next session, which is entitled Clinical Trial Considerations and Using RWE to Help Inform Value-Based Agreements. And as we know, value-based agreements is fast coming into the forefront. We're very happy to also announce that this session is sponsored by our colleagues from AstraZeneca. And in fact, Leigh Funston, who is the senior lead, National Policy and Industry Affairs at AstraZeneca, will be leading this session as a discussant today. We have three panelists with us, and I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. As Executive Director of the IQVIA Institute for Human Data Science, Murray Aitken provides policy setters and decision makers in the global health sector with evidence, analysis, and insights that contribute to the advancement of human data science to improve human health outcomes. Throughout his 15-plus year tenure at IQVIA, Aitken has served in various roles for various roles responsible for healthcare insights, corporate strategy, consulting, and other services. Prior to that, Murray was a partner with McKinsey & Company in the U.S. and also in South Korea, covering a broad range of industries, including life sciences and consumer goods. He holds an MBA with distinction from Harvard University and a Master of Commerce from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Our second speaker is a biochemist by education, Dr. Michael Seawald, has built expertise in analytical disciplines during his academic career and has authored and co-authored publications in many, many leading journals. Michael began his industry career in the era of bioinformatics, then moved through a number of positions of increasing responsibility in finance, strategy, marketing, and development. In his current role, Michael is heading evidence for the biopharmaceuticals division at AstraZeneca. And our third speaker is Dr. Christopher McCabe, who brings more than 25 years of experience as a health economist to his role as the Executive Director, Institute of Health Economics. He trained and worked for 20 years in the UK before emigrating to Canada. He was more recently a professor of health economics at the University of Alberta, where he was appointed Capital Health Endowed Research Chair, leading two Genome Canada research groups focused on the evaluation, adoption, and implementation of precision medicine technologies. Importantly, he has also held roles with CADIF and PMPRB. He is currently chair of the Royal Society of Canada COVID Task Force Working Group on the Economy. So I think we'll have a wonderful perspective on how our new normal, so to speak, is influencing these agreements. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Murray Aitken.
Great, thank you. And thank you to Colorectal Cancer Canada for this invitation to join this important series of discussions related to precision medicine and, in this case, advancing the use of real-world evidence in supporting those medicines. What I want to spend a few minutes doing this afternoon is really just framing what we see happening from the perspective of IQVIA and the IQVIA Institute in terms of the progress that's being made with respect to the availability of precision medicines and the value that they're able to bring patients and health systems. We'll talk about the role that that real-world data is playing and can play, both from a drug safety and efficacy perspective, as well as the role that this data can play in reaching value-based arrangements of one type or another. And we'll talk a little bit about the technology platforms that support that, and then some thoughts about how this can all come together in order to support the effective use of precision medicines going forward, drawing on the power and the value that real-world evidence can bring. So I thought we would start by just again framing the evolving evidence demands that we see. And this is really I would say, a global perspective. The details differ in every country, but at some level, we are seeing a similar set of trends around the growing demands to demonstrate product value and prove product safety and effectiveness. As we move to greater use of precision therapies, especially in oncology, and the need for evidence that can be used to support the use of therapeutics and measure the effectiveness of therapeutics in smaller and diverse subgroups. We also see the demand for demonstrating value and the contribution that medicines can make in increasing the productivity of an overall health system, and what that means again in the context of precision therapies as well. And then we also see an increased demand to demonstrate safety for newly introduced drugs, and there's a number of dynamics that are sort of driving that need and demand for increased safety commitments. So let me sort of just talk through some of what backs that up, and I'm starting with a slide that we started showing a few years ago when the font size was very large, and each year, as we update it, still with a 5-year view, the font gets smaller and smaller, and that's a reflection of really the surge in innovation that we've seen across the oncology space. This is showing the new active substances that have been launched in the US over the last 5 years by indication. And this includes 60 new molecules, about 115 new indications that have been approved across 22 different tumor types, as you can see around the circle, including colorectal cancer, and indeed including those therapeutics that now have a tumor agnostic label. So this is a stunning story of success and the fruits of the investments and efforts that have been made over the past couple of decades in terms of bringing these new therapeutics through clinical development and into the marketplace and to make them available to patients. What's notable is 93% of these new therapies are targeted therapies, and many of them require or have a biomarker associated with them, and where that biomarker is used in order to predict patient response and used to identify which patients are likely to respond to a particular treatment. So this is one part of the story in terms of the surge of innovation. We've also seen a lot of shifts in the past few years from a regulatory perspective, at least in the US, and I'm not so clear how much things have changed in Canada, but I think it's worth understanding what's been happening at the US FDA, where we've seen a number of new initiatives that are helping to accelerate product approvals and to streamline the process by which new therapeutics can reach patients. One aspect of these accelerated approvals is the requirement as part of that approval for additional information to be gathered following the approval of the drug in order to demonstrate the efficacy as well as the safety of the new drugs. And again, this goes beyond the sort of typical post-approval safety studies that are always required. This is for that subset of new drugs that are approved on an accelerated approval basis. And what we're showing here is the relative amount of evidence that's required to be captured following the approval of the drug relative to the amount that was included in the pivotal trials that were the basis for the drug's approval. And so the light green bars are the number of subject years at the time of approval, and the dark green are the requirements for the additional number of subject years of data to be gathered. And at the top, we're showing just sort of the multiple of the post-approval requirements relative to the pivotal trial number of subject years. So you can see here that a lot more data, a lot more evidence is required now to be gathered as a part of the accelerated approval process, which is also bringing the new therapies through approval and to patients faster than has typically been the case. So this is a second dynamic that is very important and relevant, again, to the way in which precision medicines are coming to market and the way in which real-world evidence can be harnessed following the introduction of drugs. And most of these drugs indeed are oncology drugs. A third dynamic that we're drawing attention to in some of our work is the importance of the biomarker tests that in some respects lie at the heart of precision medicines, and where the use of those biomarker tests is a critical way in which these precision medicines are able to be used effectively. What we know, however, is that there are barriers to the effective and timely use of these tests and the interpretation of the tests, and they're leading to treatment decisions. And these can occur across the patient journey as we lay it out here. Starting from the sort of detection of a cancer or tumor and a tissue biopsy, all the way through ultimately to the decision about a specific treatment and the initiation of that treatment. And what we're showing here is just sort of stepping through the many steps that come between the start of this journey and the initiation of treatment, with respect to the need for the biomarker testing and its interpretation and its communication that can raise barriers and delays in terms of patients initiating their care. This is based on some work that we've been doing in the US. Things differ quite a bit in terms of different healthcare settings, but I think that this is such an important part of the precision medicine journey. And as we see more biomarkers be developed and deployed in the precision medicine arena. Understanding these barriers and working to remove them is a critical part of delivering the full value of precision medicine to patients. So that gives some backdrop perhaps to, again, these evolving evidence demands that we see out there. The flip side is that we've got more options available to meet those evidence demands because we have more data sources generating more data that is able to be accessed and worked with in some way. And I know prior panels and speakers have been speaking of this as well. So we have a lot of new sources of the data, whether it be through mobile devices, new types of sensors, digital reported, patient-reported data, and so on. We also have advances in evidence methods, and that can be around new study designs that incorporate some of the new data sources, and more generally, the increasing use of real-world data. So one of the things that we think about is how can we optimize the way in which studies of a drug's safety and effectiveness, how can those studies be optimized, drawing on both primary research and studies, such as through clinical trials, randomized RCTs, or through registries and the sort of prospective research approach there. But also where the information can come from secondary studies, database studies looking, based on EMR data or insurance claims data, or other more retrospective studies that are possible. We see this sort of sweet spot in the middle, which really draws on the best of each as new ways to design studies that will reduce cost, reduce the time it takes to reach a conclusion, that can also help to increase the representativeness of the subjects or patients that are being studied by leveraging both data types. And there's sort of 4 different ways in which study design we think can be enhanced in this manner. One is augmenting the RCT data with real-world data as comparative evidence that a new drug can be compared to. These studies designs can also extend in time beyond the initial RCT to follow patients after they've completed that RCT at a significantly lower cost than the cost of following them in the manner that RCTs are conducted. These studies can also be enriched by secondary data that comes from data sources that were not part of the initial RCTs, and provide a richer insight as to the effectiveness of the drug on particular patient segments that can actually draw in some of the behavioral and social determinant factors that we know have a big impact on patient outcomes, link that to the RCT data, but use that to enrich the studies themselves. So these are all ways that we can advance the way in which studies are designed for precision medicines, and which draw upon the growing availability of the real-world data and evidence. And then we also have technology platforms that can help bring scalable approaches to the evidence generation. And I think this is where we've seen tremendous advances in the past few years, where the costs of technology have fallen dramatically. And that enables us to be able to gather and link real-world data at orders of magnitude greater volumes, with greater timeliness, and also with greater precision and cleanliness of the data that enables it to be linked and integrated and interrogated in many different ways in order to yield insights. So these scalable approaches, as we call them, many of which embed artificial intelligence or machine learning, are able to yield stakeholder-specific insights and applications, and that can be supportive of providers, of payers, of regulators, and very much play into the value-based arrangements that we also want to talk about and see as an important component of bringing precision medicines to more patients. So if you combine the secondary data, the real-world evidence, and data that's available with the technology platforms that enable that data to be, the value of that data to be harnessed, then we do open up new opportunities for advancing real-world evidence use in value-based arrangements. And this is a way that we think about four major areas of consideration that are required in order to really move this forward and frankly deliver the full value that's been promised for a while but not always delivered fully in terms of striking and executing value-based arrangements. So the first bucket is around the infrastructure, and I've talked somewhat about that. Having the infrastructure in place that enables relevant data to be captured and accessed, a set of data standards which enable the data to be accessed and integrated in a way that doesn't require a huge amount of manual intervention, though we know that that's still a part of the landscape. But also interoperability standards, for example, are critical to be able to draw from multiple different data sources. And of course, data security and privacy is also paramount, right? We are dealing with personal healthcare data. At IQVIA, we're always working with de-identified data. Nevertheless, data security and privacy protection is paramount throughout the course of this data being worked with. There's also a set of issues around what we call the payer and product characteristics. Value-based arrangements don't work for everyone, and they don't work for every product. So in some cases, and we've seen a lot of this in the US, the payer motivation and the ability to enter into value-based arrangements and actually to execute against them from the payer perspective is just not there. And certainly not there in a way that can be scaled beyond one or two sort of one-off arrangements. And if we're going to really move forward with respect to value-based arrangements, there's still a gap to be filled with respect to payer readiness for this. It may be a little different in single payer systems, and I know we'll talk about some of those examples on this panel. But it's easy to say, well, payers, of course, are interested in these value-based arrangements. But in many cases, they are more complex than what payers are used to dealing with and working with, and they may not have the infrastructure required to actually execute against these arrangements. And not every product profile fits a value-based arrangement, and we can talk about what makes a product fit for these arrangements and what maybe doesn't. And then the final point here is that there has to be value to each side of a value-based arrangement. And that value has to exceed, frankly, the cost of executing against a particular arrangement. And again, what we've seen in the US is that many times that value doesn't reach that threshold, and therefore these arrangements are not entered into. There needs to be a regulatory framework that is supportive of and consistent with the goals and operations of value-based arrangements. There needs to be regulatory clarity and alignment. There should be convergence between what a regulator is looking for from their perspective and what payers and manufacturers are looking for in terms of their value-based arrangements. It won't be complete convergence, but it's important that there's some level of alignment there. And there's a lot of discussion about what constitutes regulatory grade data and when is that really available. Again, referring to the US, the 21st Century Cures Act has been a huge step forward in advancing the discussion, thinking, and clarifying what exactly that means. And that's definitely removing hurdles to these types of arrangements. And then the fourth area, perhaps the most important.
Murray, may I just, is that we have about 1 minute left on your presentation?
Yep. Okay, I will wrap it up.
No, please.
Sure, because I think the fourth area is one that may be self-evident, but also one that we can't skip by, which is willing participants, and trust is absolutely central to any sort of a value-based arrangement being made. And in that context, I do call out the role that patient support groups can play as a trusted partner in these sorts of arrangements, and that's something perhaps we can talk about a little bit later on. But I don't want to miss making that point. So just to wrap up, in terms of advancing real-world evidence use in support of precision medicines, the demands for evidence are growing. The good news is there's more data available that can be used in a range of different ways, and which are supported by scalable technology-driven approaches. But there are still important considerations for exactly how far we can go and how quickly, in terms of particularly around value-based arrangements in support of precision medicines. So with that, I will hand back or hand over. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm sorry that we had to end what was really very succinct summary of what's required. So we're going to pass it over to Dr. Seawald at this stage.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm very glad to be invited and present on behalf of AstraZeneca. As you can imagine, AstraZeneca is very supportive of value-based agreements, because they provide a great opportunity to work with health systems, demonstrate the value of the products that we bring, but at the same point in time, achieve also to show more value for our products, most prominently for patients, but also more value for payers and for the providers. So with my presentation, I would like to take you through a couple of aspects here. And please let me start with an example that highlights what this really means and why this is such an important topic. There are so many technicalities required, methodologies required, but can we put it in a nutshell and explain why are value-based agreements a good thing and what is it really about? So this slide speaks about a Swedish example. There's a myocardial infarction registry that has been looked at, And it's a really interesting example because at some point in the past, the data were made public. So you could say outcomes transparency was achieved. And based on this outcomes transparency within the healthcare system in Sweden, academia, but also the providers and the physicians could actually start to understand what is going on and what can be improved. And very interestingly, based on that research, and of course it's a lot of work that went into this, it was possible to significantly improve the outcomes as measured by this particular quality index. And that's a dramatic change, as you can see here. And so now that makes everybody wonder. And at the time, there was a big discussion for sure. It even made it, to the newspapers to say, what are those other quality indices that we should be starting to look at? How much can we learn and benefit from such an outcomes transparency in other disease areas? And so that was looked at. And interestingly, outcomes variation is a worldwide problem. Almost no matter what outcome you look at, you will find a variation. Maybe that's not a surprise. But for instance, if you look at a 20 times variation in mortality after colon cancer surgery in Swedish hospitals, it starts to get very surprising. And you certainly look for tools and means to optimize. So the natural consequence is people basically realized, well, we would like to measure those outcomes. We would like to measure them in a comparable fashion. So what are those outcomes that ideally everybody would agree and adhere to in measuring and in quantifying health outcomes? And next, what would be those best practices? And can we exchange on those best practices across geographies, across hospitals, and make sure we implement them in hospital protocols or in clinical guidelines? That is really what value-based agreements are about, to starting to measure, to start to benchmark and to start to improve, such that the health system, but importantly, the patient is benefiting from those improvements. So that's really important point to say, it's not just a quality index that goes up, but ultimately there should be constructs available that support patient access, and they provide additional value for payers and providers. And so you could even, see four main stakeholders benefiting from that: the patient, the payers, the manufacturers, and the healthcare professionals. That's why some people have called this quadruple aim, because it can benefit multiple parties. So I brought a couple of examples. Here's one from competition, and I thought it's a really insightful one. So it was the case that for the product Revlimid, there was a risk-sharing agreement being discussed with the UK healthcare system, and the initial proposal essentially was rejected at the time by NICE. So obviously, the innovator company, you start to think really hard, what can you do to show the value and to gain that trust that you can, provide access or that patients have access to that medicine. And what was done was that essentially data from the healthcare system was used. Such data from the system is often called real-world data. And when you use it for decision making, it's often referred to as real-world evidence. So in this case, data sources were used that provided prescribing data. So data from the system on prescriptions were going into this analysis. And essentially then it was looked at, can we define a certain scheme that helps to quantify and that helps to demonstrate back to the UK healthcare system that this product has the value that the company sees. And that's an interesting improvement. Previously the company had brought trial data from phase 3 that was used to register the drug. Now it's stepping into a new situation where data from the healthcare system is used to show the value of the product once again. And it turned out to be the case that this then had convinced ultimately the stakeholders, and those real-world treatment patterns were used to confirm the value of the proposed patient access scheme. And I bring this as a representative example, and as one of those examples that you find across the globe, in this case from the UK. The second example I wanted to bring is from AstraZeneca, coming from Spain. So also in the area of oncology, we wanted to work with the Spanish healthcare system to basically provide a tracking system. And the interesting challenge is that in Spain, you would not necessarily have, national data tracking systems. In this case, also prescribing data were not, used to support the data collection, but something else was needed. And that's, I think, also an important situation to reflect on. Because it is insightful in telling and explaining that, maybe you don't need a sophisticated data collection already. You can actually also take a very focused approach forward and provide a customized solution to measure what you would like to measure. So in this case, as a company, we proposed a value-based agreements. It was informed by the clinical trial data and then further supported by real-world data monitoring. And the monitoring essentially then was provided by building a web-based platform that is now publicly available, and the physicians are using it in a very focused fashion. River data is collected that allows them to follow the value-based agreement in Spain. So result was this has worked. The platform is available and helpful to get the job done. And interestingly, now you can in real time follow up on the agreement, and you can follow the outcomes also in a real time fashion. And you can benefit from a continued measurement of those health outcomes and can essentially learn from them. So that is a second example for Spain. And I've picked both examples by, focusing on those examples that are most pragmatic and that would not necessarily require a big data asset on the side of the payers, for instance. And along the same lines, I think it's also interesting to look across the countries. And there's a report from 2017 shown here, highlighting that Italy leads in the development of publicly disclosed innovative contracts. US certainly also being, very close with a high number of value-based agreements. We should acknowledge that there will be many more agreements which are not disclosed and maybe missing in the statistics. But Italy is very interesting because of the strong position. And also, as you see now in the second part of this chart, essentially Italy is also not one of those countries where you would have a lot of registries. On the contrary, you have some, very, very good ones, but not so many. So essentially in Italy, there are quite a few of those very focused data collections. And this is typically the way how those value-based agreements get done in that country. So to summarize, what are those key opportunities that value-based agreements provide, and why are they so attractive to payers and to also to innovator companies? I would like to point out first and foremost, I think they do enable a stronger stakeholder collaboration and ultimately help to improve patient outcomes. And that in itself already should be seen as a real value provided to the system. But furthermore, there's an opportunity for payers. Nowadays, I think every company is thinking about digital technologies and digital transformation to get ready for the future and build those skills and capabilities. Now, with value-based agreements, that is the invitation to do this exactly, where as a payer, you can be improving, and you would not just build a digital infrastructure, but you would also improve some of those agreements that essentially are part of your business. So that would be then something to do as a payer, but potentially also with academia and with vendors. And since you have previously heard from IQVIA, essentially a vendor in the space, and soon we hear from Chris McCabe that also there are academic researchers out there that have those capabilities. And that's, I think, exactly the collaboration opportunity for payers, in addition to working with companies like AstraZeneca. Third point is, while I wanted to bring examples from outside Canada, there are certainly also best practices within Canada available, and that is something to look into and to further strengthen, of course. And then, of course, it's an opportunity to collaborate across the nations. For instance, what are those colon cancer outcomes that are studied across the world? And what are the best practices for measuring colon cancer outcomes, such that, you know, the patients in Canada would benefit from quantifying those health outcomes and improving them going forward. Another point is to say that, you know, once you start building those capabilities, you start with one value-based agreement, you start to have more. Of course, everybody will start to learn because you build those analytical skills, and you will have also insights beyond that particular value-based agreement, which is another benefit. And finally, you know, I brought those examples for very focused data collections for another reason, which is to say that you do not necessarily need to have those, you know, large and you know, big national registries in place. In some countries, it took basically many years, sometimes decades, to build up those national registries. But by all means, you can very much start in a very pragmatic and very focused fashion to build value-based agreements. My advice would just be to keep the bigger picture, you know, in mind, and ideally there's harmonization, there's standardization, for instance, across certain disease outcomes, such that while you start with, you know, individual agreements, not all of them are ideally done in a different fashion, but there's some kind of harmonization across those agreements. So last slide I would like to show is that of course, we see a real opportunity for governments, for payers, and for providers to essentially enhance the data tracking infrastructure and the capability, and to move towards those value-based agreements and improve on the traditional concepts of setting up access agreements. You know, traditionally there would be a price negotiation. Traditionally, you would maybe discuss rebates, or you would, you know, look in certain volume caps. I think here's an opportunity to go beyond that and look at health outcomes, look at what is the most meaningful value you would like to provide to patients in the system, and that is the opportunity that we see for external stakeholders. As an innovator company, AstraZeneca, of course, is very keen on you know, collaborating. Of course, we would be glad to work together with governments, payers, and providers to ensure that those systems are in place, the capabilities are built, and that ultimately better outcomes for patients and for the healthcare system is achieved. With that last slide, let me say thank you again for the opportunity. I'm very glad to also join the panel, and I'm very glad to hand over to Chris McCabe, who's the next speaker on the list. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Murray, and for the invitation to be on this panel. It's a really great and timely topic, and I'm going to talk to you about something at a bit more of a granular level. I know in Canada there's a lot of change going on in this space, and a lot of concern about, are people actually figuring out how we bridge the gap between the changing levels of evidence that regulators are using to approve new drugs, especially precision medicines, for market access, and the need of payers, their evidence needs. And I want to, you know, present to you some work that we're doing, partly to reassure you that we are thinking about how to address this operationally. We're not just conceptual level. We are doing work on how to make this all work in practice. So I'm going to talk to you about something we call research-oriented market access. So background, I'm sure you all know. Drug programs face increasing budgetary pressures. COVID-19 is only worse. To give you a sense of how COVID-19 is likely to impact on public finances, the 2009 economic stimulus for Canada after the financial crisis was $39 billion. we have already committed 325 billion to COVID at the federal level. So these are uncharted financial times for governments. It's inevitable we're going to have some challenges. So these budgetary pressures are not going to go away. And we are going to need to use evidence to inform our decisions about what's valuable and what's not valuable. But we do not want to walk away from the innovations that are coming out of the life sciences industries and the opportunity to improve the lives of Canadians. So today we're going to talk to you about this protocol we called research-oriented market access, a concept of life cycle health technology assessment, where we consider the value of a technology over its life cycle, and we explicitly consider how we accumulate more evidence and get greater certainty about the value of a technology during its life cycle. So Lifecycle HTA, framework that builds upon existing HTA using very much the same sort of methods. And it's a response to the increasing volume of promising but high cost and highly uncertain technologies that regulators are approving for market access. Because the reality is, while a regulator can give a notice of compliance with conditions or an accelerated regulatory approval, the moment they ask for more evidence, and as Murray described, that is increasingly the case, the success of the technology, their ability to meet the regulator's evidence requirements, is conditional upon people agreeing to pay for it. Governments or healthcare funders have to agree to pay for the technology for that evidence to be generated. So we've got some very specific challenges that are being given to payers by regulatory authorities. And the payers have different objectives because they are typically responsible for promoting the health of all of the individuals whose healthcare they governments, sometimes it's insurance companies, but they have an explicit group of people who they are responsible for. So we get some specific technologies and specific challenges from these technologies to conventional reimbursement decision-making processes. They're highly uncertain, so they're high risk. They're usually high cost, and that may be a large budget impact, or it might be a high cost per person. And they have to think about what they will have to give up in terms of care for other patients, given their fixed budgets. So, in this context, uncertainty has a value. Decision makers are really concerned with the risk of making the wrong decision. If they agree to fund something that turns out not to be good value, then that's a problem. They have given up other people's healthcare to a greater magnitude than they have gained. So that's difficult to justify. Equally, if they say no to high value technologies, then that's a missed opportunity to improve the health of the people they look after. So the uncertainty actually has a value. An activity that reduces uncertainty has a value by extension. So when our objective is to deliver an economic sustainable reimbursement strategy, we can use the value of uncertainty to identify an evidence-based market access price. So what's the uncertainty that we want to reduce by gaining evidence through use? And what's the value of that? Because that can guide the discount. Equally, once we've accumulated that evidence, we've reduced the uncertainty, and that can inform the specification of a long-term market access price, which reflects the additional evidence and the greater certainty we have about the value proposition for the technology. So, ROMA addresses uncertainty, and we've got a number of sources of uncertainty. We're uncertain often about the effectiveness. We're sometimes uncertainty about the relationship between the outcome that's measured in the clinical trial, maybe progression-free survival, and the outcome that we're really interested. That might be quality of life, or it might be overall survival. But we're uncertain about that. We're often uncertain about clinical pathways. New technologies quite often change clinical pathways in very good ways, but we're not certain about that. And so we want to incorporate that uncertainty into our evidence accumulation. There's also a fourth category of uncertainty that's methodological, which is outside of the scope for today. Parameter uncertainty, as I say, conventional HTA addresses it through something called probabilistic sensitivity analysis. And really all it's doing is saying, is the total uncertainty about the value proposition right now such that we'd say no to this technology? It's kind of a dichotomous yes or no treatment of uncertainty. We don't like that. That's not helpful. It doesn't promote patient access. It doesn't support innovation. It's problematic. In Roma, we quantify that uncertainty and we say, how does real-world evidence, when we combine it with the evidence from the clinical trial program, allow us to reduce that uncertainty? And that tells us what the value of doing the real-world evidence, allowing the technology into use, is. Assumption uncertainty. Again, HTA conventionally just kind of has to live with that assumption. It's noted to the decision makers. They make a judgment about how comfortable they are or they aren't. But that's about as far as they can go. You know, they'll rarely get to the point where that assumption will lead them to say no if on balance everything else says yes. Roma says, okay, we'll move with this assumption, but we will collect data to validate it and we will reduce the risk of it. We're using the RWE to see how well the interim proxy outcome measure, progression-free survival, is related to what we're really interested in buying, which is health. So it's the quality of life of the patients, it's the length of life of the patients. We can get the real data we're interested if we do Roma. Structural uncertainty, again, we will see in practice what happens to the clinical pathways. The decision makers kind of have to accept a best bet about what the clinical pathway impact will be, but they don't get data and they just have to make a call at that moment in time. Through Roma, we can actually see what happens and incorporate that into the evidence base that's used to review the decision about the price and whether to invest long-term at all at the end of the Roma period. So 3 phases of Roma. There's a feasibility and a go, no go. So can we do this? And if we can, should we? Then there's a prediction and design of the monitoring program. So where do we think the value for the technology comes from? Okay, how much evidence will we need to get on those particular aspects of the clinical pathway? And then how would we monitor that in practice? And finally, some decision rules. So I'm going to quickly go through these. I'm going to throw a few technical terms at you, and I'll try to make sure I give an accessible explanation of what they are as we go. But I think it's important people realize there's some real hard thinking and there's some operational technology in play here. So we've developed a methodological protocol, which is based upon cost-effectiveness analysis, which we all do for HTA, and this idea of value of information. So essentially, it's how do we reduce the risk of making the wrong decision long-term? That's the value of the information, okay? So we leverage administrative data assets for collecting data, getting new evidence, synthesizing with existing evidence and undertaking reanalyses. We develop multiple research designs to try and find the most efficient design because we don't want a technology to be in this conditional access process longer than necessary. And we don't want more patients to be exposed to this conditional access circumstance longer than necessary. And we don't want a good technology being under a conditional licensing situation for the company longer than necessary. So we want to be efficient in this. And then we use that design to facilitate RWA reanalysis and informed decision-making. And each of the stages are distinguished by specific continuation criteria. So if we get to a point where we should stop, we actually stop. So we don't do it more for longer than we have to. So stage 1, the purpose of this stage is to provide guidance on what we should do to design the research-oriented market access. So it's a standard cost-effectiveness analysis, looking at expected net benefit. So that is simply how much the improvement we expect to see in the health of patients once we've netted off the cost, which is health for other patients served by the system. And we get this range of outputs, which are the EVPPI, EVPPPI, and ENPVSI, which basically, the last one's what we're really interested in. is the expected value of the additional sample information that we collect. So the information on the patients who receive the treatment during the traditional access period. It's a de novo model, and it's designed to be as efficient as possible for the types of advanced simulation that we need to do. And we include all stakeholders at this development stage so that we develop that trust that previous speakers have alluded to. It's really important. We all have to travel on this journey together so that we believe the results. So we conduct a scoping review, we develop a model, we run the analyses. The criteria here is quite simple. If there's at least one piece of information, one piece of evidence in the decision problem where the value of the information is greater than the cost to generate it from the administrative data, the real-world evidence, then we move forward. It's really simple. Trying to get my slides sticking. Oops. Can any of the technical people explain why my slide's sticking? No, I'm still getting no
help.
movement.
I was going to say help is on the way.
Thank you very much. So I'm eating up question time, so I do apologise. I will have to go a little bit quicker once we get movement. So if you just speak amongst yourselves for a little while, we'll be back with you as quickly as we can.
Just give us a moment.
I'm going to grab a moment to have a quick drink. Okay, so I won't lose it if I refresh the screen. Okay, let's see how we go. Right, that looks like where. So stage 2, we're interested in identifying the optimal research design. As I alluded to earlier, we don't want this to take longer than absolutely necessary. But how long it takes is actually dependent upon how quickly the technology diffuses through the system, how quickly clinicians use it, how quickly patients ask for it. So actually, like in a clinical trial, it isn't done instantly. We have a flow of patients into the system generating data. We have a rate at which clinical events of interest occur, and indeed non-clinical events of interest occur. And then we have, that drives how long it will take for us to see enough utilization and enough patients follow through with utilization for us to understand actually how well it works in practice. And so we have this combination of standard HTA cost-effectiveness analysis layered on top of a diffusion model so that we can model over time when we expect to have enough data to revisit the evidence base and make an updated decision about long-term value. So we're reviewing these candidate research designs, and again, we have this continuation criteria. There must be a positive expected net present value of sample information. That simply means that the value of the sample information, the study, is greater than the cost of doing it. Okay? And so we've got a little example here on the next slide, I think, where we can see that. No, a little bit further to go. Stage 3, we choose one of the designs. So this is where we go into practice. We've actually got the design for the study, real-world evidence study. That is embedded in a contract, essentially the procurement contract, along with the decision criteria that will be used at the reevaluation, the reappraisal at the end of the process. And so we then have a contract that brings the technology into the system, that mandates the collection of the data we need, and also sets the criteria by which the long-term price will be established, or if the technology doesn't deliver the value, it leaves the system. And this is really valuable to payers because one of their big concerns is if they say yes to a technology that turns out not to be very good, it's very difficult for them to get it out of the system. So if the contract which takes it into the system takes it out of the system, should it not, that's a big risk taken away from them. So we can get a stopping condition. And essentially, it's when at any point, if the expected value of more information gets to 0 or less, we stop. And that might happen because actually its use in practice is exactly in line with our expectations, but we're much more uncertain. So this blue distribution, the red distribution where we were before, we same expected value, it's delivered, and we're a lot more certain. We don't need any more research. Second one is actually if it turns out not to be so good in practice, and we get to the point where we're confident enough in that result that collecting more evidence is unlikely to change our judgment that it doesn't deliver the promised value. And third, and this is the one I'd love, actually in practice it turns out to be even better. And evidence, we cannot see a likely outcome of more evidence that would change our view that this is a good value technology. So we keep monitoring that so that we can stop the process as quickly as we can. So, a vignette, what's the traditional HTA compared to Roma? Well, this is a diabetes drug. And CADA said, well, there's limitations and a high degree of uncertainty. They said, we couldn't be confident about the cost of a lack of transparency, and it had some real limitations. So there's insufficient information available to justify a price greater than what's currently reimbursed for competitors, which is rarely enough to be commercially viable for the company. Instead, Roma says, well, we've got the clinical pathway, we've done de novo model development, and everybody's seen it. All stakeholders have bought into this. So there's not a lack of transparency. We've just got evidentiary uncertainty. We've designed a study to address that. And now we're going to actually implement that study to generate real-world evidence so that we become more certain. So we give HTA agencies a new option. Traditionally, they can recommend with conditions, or do not recommend. Now they can approve a research-oriented market access with a specific research design and a specific price, which can go straight to an organization like PCPA for the contract. So fast-tracking that negotiation, because the HTA have given real specific direction. So with Roma, HTA agencies get an additional decision tool. It supports patients getting timely access to novel therapies. Manufacturers are ensured fair compensation at 2 points. First, fair compensation for the product at the time they launch it, reflecting the risk that it's not as good as they said, as they hoped. But secondly, then at a long-term price that reflects fair compensation for as good as it proves to be in practice. And finally, payers are supported in making efficient funding decisions. They know that the money they spend in the RWE period is good value, and it puts them in a position to be confident that the money they spend for the long-term price is also good value. So, threw a lot at you there. Thank you very much. And there's the clever people who did it all.
Thank you so much. Leigh, we're just going to pass it right over to you to begin the panel. So far, we do not have any questions through the question manager. We'd love to have your input, your comments. Please do use the question manager, the blue question mark.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. So thank you to the three panelists. Those were very outstanding, excellent presentations. And so now let's have some questions and a bit of a discussion. And Marie, I'll start with you since you were the first presenter, and you finished off your presentation with a discussion about the one group of key stakeholders that I'm particularly interested in, and that was the role of patient groups and the role they can play in sitting around the table to try to come to a value-based agreement. So can you elaborate on that and talk a little bit about what their role would look like?
Sure, and thanks for the question. I mean, for a long time, I have said that patient groups are the critical link in delivering the value of precision medicine to patients, and I think they can play an incredibly important role here. I think at some level they are the in a sense, the neutral voice, in terms of, different sides coming together with a different view about what an effective arrangement makes, how the arrangement can bring value. I think, they can keep the focus on what matters to the patients, and that can be in terms of the patient-reported outcomes or patient, priorities in terms of the clinical endpoints. At some level, also the information that drives these arrangements are the patient's information, and that gets back to the other issue about patient privacy and who owns and controls the data. And I think, to that extent that patient groups play a key role in keeping everyone on track in terms of, accessing that patient data and using it in a way that's considered appropriate to the patient in this context, developing and operating value-based arrangements. So I think they just play a vital voice in this in terms of helping to keep clarity around what value means to the patient, and also how their data, the so-called real-world data, can be put to appropriate use in the context of these sorts of arrangements.
Thank you. So, Dr. McCabe, you were talking about the Roma model. How do patients, as a stakeholder group, fit into that equation? What does that look like?
So I think it's really important that that they're engaged at the beginning as a key stakeholder group for that conversation, so that they recognize the clinical pathway, that they agree that the measures of valued impact that we capture evidence on are the ones that matter to them. And also that I think that there will need to be an agreement, possibly even contracts with patients, that they understand that if the result of this is that actually the technology is not as valuable or effective as everybody hoped, that they may lose access. Personally, it appears to have worked, that it may no longer be available underneath the system, under the payer umbrella. That's a really important thing. If payers are to agree to take on this risk in order to create evidence so that we make better decisions, then they need to be confident at the end of taking on that risk, if the answer is the technology is not as good, that the technology does go away. And that's quite a change for patients. And it's quite a change for clinicians, to be honest. I think there will need to be consideration of how patients and clinicians commit to that component of the framework. And it might be that that's where the framework falls down. But I think the important discussion to be had there.
Okay, thank you. And I think it goes to the issue that you've all talked about around transparency and trust, and everyone sort of, all the stakeholders at the table going into this with a common understanding of all the moving pieces. Michael, can you talk about, you gave a couple of examples from other countries. Can you talk about some of the possibly implementation challenges that still exist in other places, and what are some pitfalls that we could be aware of in Canada? Oh, you're on mute.
Yes, now it should work. Absolutely. So, I mean, there are pitfalls indeed. So some of the pitfalls include certainly data privacy. Some of the pitfalls include how to set up the outcomes tracking. Some of the pitfalls include that you may develop your own solution and realize maybe later on it's not sustainable long term. And I think some of the solutions, and quite a few of the solutions, have been mentioned. So there are essentially plenty of best practices available the data science companies, such as IQVIA, for instance, are there to help. Academic institutions are there that specialize in some of the methodology. And so there's this knowledge available. It would be a risk to develop everything on your own, but rather it's something to, it's an area to embrace collaborations, to tackle some of the challenges. I think those are the key ones that I would highlight. I think also one last comment that I would make on the challenges is that ideally it is seen as an opportunity to transform the analytics capabilities inside the payer organization. Because if you approach this as a one-off, maybe you just get a one-off. But if you realize that this could be a long-term transformation of how you operate your finances, your billing system, your transactional infrastructure that you have as a payer or as any stakeholder. This would also be relevant for the hospitals with their EHR system. Once it's really built into the digital strategy of the respective stakeholder, it starts to become a natural transformation, and then you have developed essentially beyond the one-offs. Very much worth going for. And you want to be in it, I think, for the long run and not necessarily for the short-term win. Those are my comments. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Murray, question for you. So you discussed and showed a great image of all of the innovation in oncology. The surge of innovation. And so is this making it easier or more difficult for value-based agreements to be designed and implemented?
I would say it's making it more urgent that we find a way to practically be able to design and implement these arrangements, because looking at what's happening and we see in the pipeline what's about to happen, it does put a lot of stress, on the system. And the good news is there is this huge surge of innovation, but it does make it more challenging to set up these kinds of arrangements, whether it be, the examples that Michael gave or the methodology that Chris made. And I would draw special attention to what we see as an acceleration in the cycle of innovation, right? It used to be we could talk about new drugs with sort of a 5 to 10 year runway of life and use. And so we have the time to systematically assess the value, over time. In oncology, in particular, now things are cycling every sort of 3 to 5 years, and being able to set up and execute these kinds of value-based arrangements on that time frame is another kind of challenge. We need sort of agile, flexible, systems that can be quickly put into place and tracked. Because if you wait 3 years, there's going to be a next generation, therapeutic coming out of the pipeline that people are now going to be sort of more interested in, and you're still sitting there, implementing your value-based agreement. So I don't think we've quite cracked. I mean, I'm interested in what the others think as well, whether we've really sort of cracked the code here on how do you do this with a cycling that is consistent with the innovation cycle that's coming through the R&D pipelines.
Thank you.
Leigh?
Okay. Yes.
Would it help you to know that there's a question from one of your AstraZeneca colleagues on the line?
Oh, great.
Can you see it?
Let me take a look. I'm looking at my own
that.
questions that I've got in front of me, but
Yes, and I don't want to interrupt your flow, but there is
That's
one of
okay.
your colleagues
Sure.
says, so the question actually, and I'm going to read it because it's a multi-layered question and it's got some comments, and it is from Ryan Walton from AstraZeneca. So first and foremost, great presentations across the board, and I thought you would all like to know that. Under Chris's framework, which is hugely interesting, who actually executes the RWE studies? For example, is it a government-linked agency? So that's question number one. And what impact does provincial fragmentation have on the process? Ryan goes on to say, for example, is the study executed in a handful of provinces, perhaps with mature data infrastructure, and then that is considered as adjudicating data for all jurisdictions in Canada. So the point here is that considered as adjudicating data for all jurisdictions in Canada if you're using just select provinces? Also interested in Michael's reaction to the framework in terms of comparability with other jurisdictions around the world. So that was a mouthful. So maybe we'll start with you, Chris, on the framework and who executes the RWE studies.
You're on mute.
Great questions. It does require quite mature data infrastructure. In Canada, I think actually we have the bigger provinces do have the maturity of data infrastructure to deliver this, and I think they because the governments essentially one way or another fund the healthcare systems. Actually, governments would deliver, and so that gives a couple of things. Not only do other provinces who may not be collecting data have to believe in the data, the other stakeholders have to believe in the data, and so the validation of the quality of the data is really important. So it might be things that we have discussed here in Alberta is that you might have a not-for-profit solely for the purpose of delivering these analyses, delivering these studies, so that a trusted third party, not for so that everybody knows they're delivering this because of the data infrastructure and they have the expertise, but they are not beholden either to governments or manufacturers. So an arm's length body, possibly a not-for-profit, that specialises in delivering these and has to be trusted by all the provinces and territories that sign up to use the data. And I think in Kansas, we probably would get buy-in, and you could run them in 2 or 3 provinces with a better data infrastructure. Challenging in the rarer cancers and rarer diseases generally, where you've got geographic clusters, and kind of the worst case scenario is where the cluster of cases where you want the evidence generated is not in the same place as the data infrastructure that would capture it. But yeah, we're thinking about that quite a lot at the moment. I think they're great questions, and I don't have a pat answer. So thanks for that.
Okay. And Michael, maybe I'll just ask you to comment on the second part of that. He was interested in Michael's reaction to the framework in terms of comparability with other jurisdictions around the world.
Yeah, sure. No, I think Chris has done a great job in developing this methodology, and I would basically say this is a leading methodology, I think, worldwide. You know, when we look at value-based agreements, we recognize that the bulk of those agreements still are dominated by some kind of financial character. You know, think terms like, you know, tiered pricing structures, portfolio mixes, you know, maybe there are caps. In fact, many of the Italian examples I gave would essentially, you know, imply a certain cap. And so along those lines, I think what Chris presented is actually really, really interesting, because this is a focused and prospectively and pre-specified evidence generation approach that is involved. And that is some of what we see in the leading health systems across the world, but it's very much an area of development. Having that said, I think it's very much the area where the future should be going. And we see some of those examples, I think, in the UK. I know some of those examples in the US, but not so many. And for me, this is where we should be heading, because such an approach can be discussed, for instance, also with medical societies, with clinicians, with patients, and it goes much beyond a purely financially focused approach.
Great, thank you. Leigh, I'll pass it back to you for one final short question, if you have
Sure.
one.
Okay, I do. So I'll direct this question to Dr. McCabe. So, we've talked about, provinces with mature data capability systems and others that are not quite there yet. And certainly COVID-19 has shone quite a light on, generally speaking, the need for better data collection, tracking, measurement, reporting, et cetera. Do you see COVID accelerating our Canadian data infrastructure systems province by province? Is this going to sort of help us in the long run?
So I think it's an opportunity for not just, I don't think it should be province by province. I think health data is one example of the fact that in future data and the digital infrastructure through which it flows are utilities. We as individuals will need access to high-speed internet and the devices that enable us to use that in the same way as we need access to water and sewage and all the utilities. It's going to be essential to the way we live our life. It's going to be essential to our economic development and prosperity. We saw, an almost tripling of the amount of going on via the internet in the first 6 months of COVID in Canada. We're going to see lots of jobs. We're going to see education, more and more. Not a lot of stuff that went online will not come back offline. And so I think we will need a national strategy for the data infrastructure so that all individuals have access to this. And it will be the responsibility of health systems to ensure that they utilize that infrastructure so that we are able, in 10 years' time, that people won't ask questions about, can we get the data? That will be a given. So that's what I hope. We should use this as an opportunity to realize that the future is substantially digital, and digital is a utility for the future Canadian economy and society.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll end it there. And I also want to say to the folks that submitted questions, I'm sorry we didn't get to you. I promise you that they will be answered after the conference. We've got your name. We've got the questions. So they'll be fed back to the presenters. We just love the questions. So thank you very much for submitting them. Also, a very large thank you to AstraZeneca. Leigh, thank you for leading the session and for sponsoring the session. And of course, to Murray, Michael, and Christopher for such fine presentations. We're going to take another 1-minute break, and then we're back for a very hands-on session where we would really love a lot of input. So come on back.